but it is a deep honor to introduce Serena. She grew up in Ohio and then New Jersey, which proves there's one smart person in our department that came out of New Jersey. And then off she went to Cornell, and Cornell has this long tradition, Dennis Regan in particular, training great young social psychologists at the undergrad level. Serena was one of those. And then moved to NYU, and for those of you, just to get a picture of social psychology, NYU was the hotspot for social cognition in the 90s and 2000s. And it was this very tightly controlled, borrowing from cognitive science tradition. And I think a lot of outsiders looking at it were wondering when it would become social, when it would be about more complicated issues. And Serena really is the pioneer in taking the tight paradigms of social cognition and then sort of blossoming it into what she's defined her career by, which is, one is how our relational self is constructed dyadically in relationships and how we sort of interact with other people. Elegant work on that. The sort of cultural identity, collective identity, and sort of moving the self out of a narrow focus to a broader conceptual focus. Early work on power, probably the most important empirical paper on power, just as you were getting tired here in around 2000. So she got her PhD at NYU with a social cognition background and just turned it into really game-changing work in that empirical tradition. Her career is defined by every possible award you would hope for, several society memberships, the early career awards, distinguished teaching award from the social sciences, and now is the Marion and Daniel Koshman Distinguished Chair in our department. So without further ado, it's my deep honor to introduce a friend and great colleague, Serena Chen. After her talk, we will have a few questions, and then there's a reception outside, so all yours.
As I'm a sister, he's like a big brother, and big brothers and how they treat little sisters, you never know what they're going to say. But that was very, very good. Okay. So, what I'm going to talk to you today about is take you through a journey of some of the work we've been doing over the last 10 to 15 years on social power on the one hand and self-expression on the other hand. And to sort of locate the work that I chose to talk about for this talk today, I want to give you a sort of a broader flavor of the various things that we study in my lab here at Berkeley. So clearly I'm interested in all issues related to the self-concept and identity. Dr. mentioned some of these. I'm interested in how we see ourselves, how we evaluate ourselves, how we treat ourselves, with compassion or not, broader identities, social identities, group memberships. And as you'll see later in my talk today, I have a very deep interest in the subjective experience of the self, how much we feel true to ourselves, how authentic we experience ourselves throughout the day. I have a big interest in close relationships, so I'm interested, there's also linkages here to the self. I'm interested in how significant others influence the self, how our past relationships have a legacy, they linger and continue to influence us for better or worse in the present. And more recently, as some of you know, my students, or some of my students, have been interested in the bidirectional link, inspired in part by fellow sleep researchers here at Berkeley, the bidirectional link between sleep and relationship health, such as relationship satisfaction, relationship behaviors, and so forth. What I'm going to focus on today is sort of the third topic area of my lab, which is social hierarchy. And here we're interested in all sorts of questions having to do with hierarchy. Most frequently, my lab is focused on, as much of the social psychological literature is focused on, the effects of being in a position or being dispositionally high or low in social power on things like how we process information, the goals we pursue, how we behave, treat other people, and so forth. There's quite a few students right now in my and Dacre's lab who are really interested in the psychological consequences of income inequality, which is this very timely and alarming topic. But today what I'll focus on in particular is tying together a couple of the areas that we study in my lab, the implications, as I said, of power for the self-concept. And I'll say more exactly what I mean by that. But let's get a handle first on what I mean by social power, or what us social psychologists mean by social power. We mean probably what you intuitively think we mean. Somebody who's in a position of power has the ability to control valued resources, like a parent having the ability to control the use of the car, to pay for those new jeans, or what have you, a boss's ability to dole out, good assignments, good projects, or what have you. Teachers have the ability to evaluate students so they have control over others' outcomes. So it's defined fairly broadly, but in terms of control over things people want and people's outcomes. There's less obvious examples. It's not always role-based, like employers, bosses, teachers, and so forth. A romantic partner who is less committed to the relationship, one could argue, has more power over their partner who is more committed, more dependent on the relationship. So many different ways to operationalize power. And in our literature, there's sort of two basic ways, not surprisingly, that people have looked at social power, either from a personality perspective, so measuring power-related traits, dispositions like how dominant are you, or we manipulate it experimentally, such as assigning people to some kind of position that comes with the ability to control others' outcomes or not. Regardless of the way that's operationalized, there's no question that, and you know this is a bit of a truism, but we have empirically demonstrated lots and lots of data demonstrating that power has quite profound and wide-ranging effects on our cognition, on the emotions we experience, on our motivation and behavior. So things like System 1, System 2 processing, our executive function, our emotional experience, the kinds of decisions we make, risky or less risky, for example, whether we pursue goals, how successful we are at it, responses to social feedback, high or low power, you're differentially responsive to, for example, social rejection, how pro-social you are toward other people, how selfish you are, and so on and so forth. No question, there's a lot of data showing that power matters. Again, what I'm going to focus specifically on is an effective power, but specifically on self-expression. And I don't mean anything fancy by self-expression. I simply mean people's tendency to express, outwardly display, for example, emotions they're feeling inside, opinions they're holding, they might express them, their dispositional traits. If they're an extroverted person, they're showing, they're expressing their extroversion. So nothing more jargony than just literally expressing various facets of the self. Your opinions, your current state, your feelings, and so forth. So here's a bit of a roadmap of where I'm going to take you today in the next, 45 minutes, about the different things we've discovered along the way that are pertinent to this question of how power affects your likelihood to express yourself. Now, interestingly, the first stop, or first bullet point here, is research that Dacker mentioned that I believe I talked about in my job talk. So I feel very gray-haired and old right now. But nonetheless, it's interesting in the context of this talk because at the time, I wasn't thinking about that research in terms of power's effects on self-expression. I was really, at the time, trying to answer, does power really corrupt people? Everyone thinks power corrupts. Does it lead to corruptive kinds of behaviors? Lord Acton, famous English historian, politician, he has proclaimed famously, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He also said, but is never quoted, that great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you super add the tendency of the certainty of corruption by authority. So he clearly thought power corrupts. He's not alone. Henry Kissinger has said corrupt politicians make the other 10% of us look bad. George Lucas, who is very much in our present day minds with Star Wars, The Force Awakens, he has said the story being told in Star Wars is a classic one. Every few hundred years a story is being told because we have a tendency to do the same things over and over again. Power corrupts, and when you're in charge, you start doing things that you think are right, but they're not. They're actually not. So no shortage of the belief that power corrupts, but what does the evidence look like? So this is a topic that a lot of people were interested in 10, 15 years ago, including us. And in the last decade, decade and a half, well, cohering with your intuitions and probably many real-world examples you can come up with of power corrupting, there's quite a lot of data out there just among social psychologists themselves. So early on, Susan Fiske and others show that power encourages, under certain conditions, stereotyping, pigeonholing people, not looking at them as individuals. It increases egocentrism, not prioritizing one's own perspective versus other people, being self-serving in your attributions for your performance, at the same time being derogatory in your evaluations of other people's performance, not the kind of boss you want. Power promotes objectification of others, seeing them as means to ends, as instruments, rather than as people with needs and goals of their own. And just as a final example, there are countless examples I will convey, but power increases your likelihood of breaking the rules, violating socially agreed upon norms. So no question, I think, both in terms of common intuition and the scientific evidence that power has the potential, at least, to corrupt. But what bugged me back then when I was young and with less gray hair was that, come on, it can't be the case that power owes a corrupt. Maybe I was being idealistic, maybe I was being hopeful. I wasn't necessarily seeing lots of examples of it in my life, but I thought, wait a minute, does power necessarily have to corrupt? So this is the work that I talked about in part in my job talk, some work that I did with, at the time, fellow graduate student Annette Lee Chai and one of our mentors, John Barge. And to tell you the story about this, bear with me, Dacre alluded to this. This was a time in the field of social psychology, social cognition in particular, where one of the big, exciting to me developments was the realization that just like we mentally represent, social psychologists, cognitive psychologists have talking about categories. We have trait categories, we have categories for situations, for objects. Well, guess what? We also mentally represent goals. So the goal to achieve, the goal to be pro-social and help others, those are mentally represented, stored in our minds. And just like a stereotype we have of jocks, they can be activated by cues in the environment, and when they are, they're set into motion, influencing our judgments and our behaviors accordingly. So we have this framework of, okay, goals are mentally represented, and what we reasoned was that, well, it certainly stands to reason that people over time, and they learn that power allows you to attain certain goals. You learn from your parents, from other socialization agents, from TV shows, what have you, that with power comes the ability to attain X, Y, and Z. For example, you might associate power with the ability to acquire wealth. But I also thought, or we also thought, that for some people, power may be associated with the goal of helping others. Power enables you to help others. So our reasoning was that in order to understand the effects of power on behavior, such as corrupt, selfish behavior versus more pro-social, other-oriented behavior, you really need to understand the goals that people associate with power. For some, power may not be associated with the default sort of self-interested, self-focused kind of goals. In fact, for some people, power may actually put you in a position to be focused on others. So whether or not power corrupts should hinge on the nature of the goals that people associate with power was the way we framed this question. So it's something that we tested across a variety of studies. Across all these studies, or most of them, we manipulated power in various direct and indirect ways, conscious and non-conscious ways, and I'll give you one example in a second. Across all studies, we're looking at the effects of power on corrupt, selfish kinds of behavior versus more other-oriented, socially responsible behavior, with the prediction that depending on what kind of goals people tend to associate with power, you're going to get different kinds of behavior. Power may well corrupt, at least among those who associate power with more selfish types of goals. And the way we operationalize other-oriented versus selfish goals was by this construct, also sort of in the air a lot at the time, which was this individual difference on relationship orientation. There are many different kinds of relationships in our lives. Some of them, for example, are more communally oriented relationships. These are the kind of relationships we have, hopefully, with family and friends, where you give benefits to your relationship partners out of someone's need. You're not keeping track of what someone gave you. It's not a tit-for-tat kind of kind of thing. It's like how a parent might treat a child, taking care of them regardless of what they stand to gain. There are other kinds of relationships where you're not so much thinking about others' needs and desires, you're thinking about what have they done for me, what have I done for them, let's just make sure it's fair, I'll do for you if you've done for me. If you do for me, I'm going to be waiting for you to, you're going to be waiting for me to give something back to you. It turns out that there are these different kinds of relationships. I'm sure you can think of examples of them. But there are individual differences in people's chronic tendency to approach relationships in general in more communally oriented ways versus more exchange-oriented ways. And using a scale, we assess this chronic personality difference with the reasoning that communally oriented people are likely to associate power with having the ability to pursue more other-oriented goals, whereas exchange-oriented people, more associated with what they stand to gain, what they stand to lose, are going to be associating power with more the attainment or the pursuit of more selfish goals. So just to give you an example of one study we did, as you know, we social psychologists love deception, so we use it a lot. We brought participants individually to John Barger's office, actually, lying to them saying, oh man, the lab room where we're going to run the study is scheduling conflict, but the professor said we can just borrow his office, so we're just going to use his office, and the RA is like fumbling with the key, acting like they don't know what's going on, they're doing their best. Then we casually, again, because this is all, happen, spur of the moment kind of thing, we casually guide the participant randomly assigned to sit either in a seating position associated with high power. Let me clue you in, that's not the graduate student seat. Across the desk is the leather chair, backed by this fancy bookshelf and so forth, and we did everything we could to make it feel and look more high power. Or we have them sit in the chair across from the professor. We made it an awful wooden desk. It might have been one of those desks that has that, one of those chairs that has that desk, but we also made them use a clipboard, the person assigned to that seat, as if they couldn't touch anything in the office. So we did all sorts of these subtle things to make them feel high or low power. And we had done pre-testing to get some validation for this manipulation of high or low power. We told them that there was another participant. Participants were supposedly being run in pairs, but oh, they left a message about running late. And okay, so let me just tell you about the study. Meanwhile, while we're waiting for this other participant to arrive, you know what? The study just involves completing a set of questionnaires from various researchers in the department. That's all. You complete some of them, the other person completes some of them. Each pair needs to complete the full set, and you're out of here. Okay, people want to get out of here. It's just like here. Okay, it's not something they're happy to be doing. Okay, so now meanwhile, the experimenter, who's practically an actor, is like, you know what? I gotta go check to see where that other participant is. You know what? Why don't you just take a look at this list of the surveys that need to be completed? And you know what, you just circle the 5 you want to do, and the other participant will have to do the 5 that you just choose, just so we can save some time. Well, unbeknownst to them, of course, this was a doctored sheet, and we doctored it to look like it really wasn't intended for their eyes, so we crossed out things as if there were changes to it. There's 10 exercises instead of 11, we had to cross one out. But of course, this is all by design. We have different minutes in terms of how long it would take to complete these surveys. And we were interested in how many minutes they would choose for themselves, leaving the remaining minutes for this alleged other participant to complete. In other words, a measure of relatively more selfish versus relatively more other-oriented behavior. Choosing less for yourself is more selfish, right? Because you can finish and get the heck out of there, and that poor other participant has to do more. And it's 39 minutes, so it's not as if you can choose even Steven. That was not a concern. Everybody was selfish on average. But anyway, still, consistent with our original hypothesis, again, we had multiple studies. The pattern looks similar, but not exactly the same. And I can answer questions later about little hiccups. But power does appear to corrupt if you're a relatively more exchange-oriented person. So you see that the blue bar is lower than the red bar, saying I took less minutes for me, leaving more minutes for the other participant when I'm in the professor's high power chair relative to the low power chair. And we don't see that corrupting pattern among communally oriented people. And if anything, you see an opposite pattern where for communal oriented people, being in a position of power relative to low power makes it actually take on more of the experimental burden relative to their lower power counterparts. So consistent with the idea that, yeah, power corrupts, but not necessarily for everyone or under all circumstances. So, like I said, this was research we originally did completely focused on does power corrupt, power's effects on behavior, not about the self per se. But what we and others realized over time, including Dacker and other social power researchers, independently and across the country and so forth, was that our findings were really, they could be looked at through the lens of a self perspective, that they weren't necessarily just about power goal associations. What we came to realize over time, and I think there's pretty strong consensus, is that it's power leading people to pursue their chronic default goals more is really just one instantiation of power amplifying expression of the self. We looked at this amplification finding in terms, and we conceptualized it in terms of power goal associations, but others have theorized in ways that also suggest this conclusion that power is going to amplify self-expression. For example, Susan Fisk, pioneer in the social psychological study of social power, she early on conceptualized power in terms of being less dependent on others. When you're less dependent on others, you don't have to worry about others as much. You're not influenced as much by others in the situation. You're freer to act. This paves the way for you to act in ways that you want, to express yourself. In Dacker's highly influential Psych Review article in 2003, he talked about how power activates the behavioral approach system. Well, the behavioral approach system is associated with being very attuned to goal attainment, reward sensitivity. It's associated with being not particularly vigilant toward threats or constraints on your pursuit of goals. And again, this inclination toward action. Again, psychological consequences that you get in a state of when you're in a position of power that are consistent with being able to express various facets of the self. In a more nuanced way, and more recently, Annika Note has shown that the powerful are better able to deploy their attention selectively and flexibly and to avoid distractions to things that they care about. Again, also consistent with this notion, this broader notion that power amplifies expression of the self. Empirically, those are all theoretical statements. Empirically, although much of the research I'm about to tell you about quickly wasn't originally framed in terms of power amplifying the self, there's a lot of findings out there that are completely consistent with this kind of conclusion. So early on, Chen and LaFrance showed in this cute set of studies that powerful people are likely to show greater correspondence between their self-reported affect, I feel happy, and their outward expressions of happiness, their smiling behavior, suggesting this self-expression. I'm expressing my inner experience of happiness on my face. Greater correlation, smiling and internal affect reported for powerful versus less powerful. Cameron Anderson and Jennifer Beardall, for his dissertation, I believe, from here, our program, he showed that when people are in a position of power or dispositionally powerful, they're more likely to express their privately held opinions outwardly in the context of a dyadic interaction. So self-expression, expression of one's opinions. The note showed that all of us vary in the kinds of trait categories we tend to use in making sense of the social world. Some of us think about everybody in terms of how shy they are, how arrogant they are, how rude they are, how extroverted they are. Oliver thinks about it in terms of all 5 dimensions of personality all the time. We have different default ways of judging other people. She found that when people are in a position of power, they're more likely to interpret a target in line with their chronically accessible trait categories. I have no idea how Oliver would interpret people with all those trait categories that he has accessible, but for example, she showed that people who tend to see the social world in terms of rudeness, when placed in a position of power, they're more likely to interpret an ambiguous target as being rude. So they're expressing their internal cognitive tendencies in that case. And some research that Amy Gordon and I did here a couple years back, we weren't interested in this notion that power amplifies the self per se, in the sense that it wasn't what was driving this research. We were interested instead in trying to resolve discrepancies in the literature about how power influences perspective taking. There was evidence suggesting power leads to less perspective taking, that egocentrism I mentioned earlier, and yet there were strands of evidence out there suggesting not always, and maybe we shouldn't believe those findings. It was unclear exactly the link between power and perspective taking. We were trying to clarify it by bringing in the notion of individual differences. Again, taking this sort of personality and social psychological approach, arguing that power should lead to perspective taking. If perspective taking is part of your general way of relating to the world, you generally are oriented toward taking into account other people and how they might feel and how they might see the world. But if your chronic tendency is to see the world through your own shoes, then power is going to amplify that tendency instead. So this is something we tested across a range of studies, and I'll give you an example of just one of them. So this was a daily diary study where we had romantic partners. Amy has a really strong interest in close relationships. She's really interested in behaviors and relationships that bode well or poorly for your relationship health, such as perspective taking. It is good to take your partner's perspective. Not what we were interested in here, but just so you know. 14 days, people reported they were in a fairly committed romantic relationship. Nightly, they were asked to report on a variety of different things, including their power, the power they experienced in their relationship that day. So this is something sort of novel that we were doing. It's sort of a side point, but sort of recognizing that how much power you have, even in an established relationship, is something that could fluctuate over time. And in fact, when you look at the range, it's not as if people show very little fluctuations in the amount of power that they had in their relationship. So every night, how much power do you feel today in your relationship? Who made more of the decisions today? Highly correlated, our index of daily power. And then self-reported, how much did you try to take your partner's perspective that day? To measure your sort of default chronic tendency to take other people's perspective or be more self-focused, we relied on this really wordy scale called the Relational Interdependent Self-Construal Scale, which I hate saying. The scale has items like my close relationships reflect an important part of who I am. Okay, so it's people for whom relationships really matter to them, really matter to how they see themselves. Not surprisingly, people who score high on the scale, I'm going to call them high relationals. There's a lot of data by Susan Cross and her colleagues. Guess what? These people tend to take others into account more when they make decisions in their relationships. They are more tuned to their partner's desires and needs, the kind of partner you may want to look for. Okay, higher relational. So we have daily power, we have daily perspective taking, and then we have this chronic individual self versus other difference variable that we measured prior to the daily diary starting. Here's what the data from this particular study looked like. Again, every study has its big pattern. Some, look slightly different, but here's what this one looked like. We had on the x-axis daily power, relatively high or relatively low, and then on the y-axis, higher numbers mean greater self-reported perspective taking. If you focus first on the days when you felt relatively low power relative to your partner, you do see some difference consistent with the individual difference of being high versus low, relationally interdependent. The solid line is higher relationals. Yeah, they're sort of reporting, yeah, I tend to take my partner's perspective more than low relational people do under low power days. But this individual difference, this expression of the self, your default tendency to take others' perspective or not, is amplified on days when you feel higher power, right? So the lines spread more under higher power days, on days when you feel higher power. So on higher power days, difference between higher and lower relationals on perspective taking is amplified. So although again, we ventured on this to try to understand power and perspective taking in various close relationships focused questions, it really is an example, another example of finding consistent with this conclusion that power amplifies self-expression. Okay, now, like many psychologists, social psychologists, included at this point again, none of this was pre-planned, of course, but at this point, I'm going to pretend like it was. We started wondering and worrying about boundary conditions and nuances to the story, because we like to do that. And one of the things that we noticed in the literature that bore on this conclusion that power amplifies the self is that nearly all of the studies, possibly all of them, examine singly either some sort of trait or dispositional form of power, so you're high in dominance or low dominance, or they experimentally manipulate power. Hey, you're in that high power role. Hey, let's prime you with words related to power or not. And yet it occurred to us that oftentimes you can't, or it's kind of difficult to fully separate out dispositional sources of power and situational sources of power. After all, in any situation that you come into, you're bringing yourself and you come with some level of dispositional power. And as our daily diary study also showed, but also our intuition told us, that the realities of life often mean or dictate that even throughout the same day, you're going to go through a variety of high and low power roles. The same individual who may be, let's say, dispositionally high in their sense of power, sometimes they're in a high power position, such as when a dispositionally high graduate student is directing their research assistants, but when they're meeting with scary department chair and Craig, they may be feeling in a lower power position. Okay, so even within the same day, the same person is moving in and out of high and low power roles. So what we started wondering about is what are the implications of the fact that sometimes your dispositional sense of power matches, it fits with the power associated with the situation, how much power you have in a given situation, versus when there's this conflict. You're this dispositionally low power person having to, lead a group, for example. Okay. So this is work that Carrie Langner, one of our former graduate students, and Rudy Mendoza-Denton and I worked on. Lots of fun. Painful review process, but lots of fun. In these studies then, because we're interested in this question, looking at both trait and situational sources of power, we're going to measure both of these things and look at their joint impact on self-expression. And to sort of understand this literature more, we discovered this entire literature on what's known as person-environment fit that most social psychologists, aren't that aware of. It's a personality. I know all this, rolling his eyes, but this is a personality and organizational, humongous literature, Charlotte, I'm sorry. And it's a really big deal in that world, Shelley. Okay, so in those worlds, it turns out, people are really interested in person-environment fit. They've looked at, for example, the impact of your values fitting the culture of the organization that employs you, and it turns out when there's fit, you feel greater job satisfaction, more commitment to the organization. Closer to home, there's social psychologists who have looked at the fit between your ideological beliefs and the values and beliefs of a certain institutional setting, such as the university you go to. And it turns out when your ideological beliefs fit your, for example, institution, your university more, you actually do better in school. Your achievement is stronger. So this is a really interesting concept, we thought, fit. We wanted to understand how power-related fit, okay, how fit in your dispositional power versus power of a role, what does that have to, what does that say for self-expression? And we noticed and found evidence, some evidence bearing on this question. Betancourt and Sheldon had this one study where they looked at the fit between people's self-reported traits, how cooperative I am, for example, and the fit between that and the traits required by a role that they were assigned to in the laboratory. You've got to be the group moderator in this group discussion. Okay? That's a role that requires being cooperative, listening, having people get along. If you're high in cooperativeness, you feel and report greater levels of self-expression than if you have a lack of fit. You're lower in cooperativeness, it doesn't fit the requirements of the situation. This is not particularly groundbreaking. It's very obvious it makes sense, but this was nonetheless an interesting finding bearing on our interest in power-related fit. So we were looking at the fit between trait power, and we used this very widely used scale that Oliver, Dacker, and Cameron Anderson developed assessing people's sense of power. It has items, I think there's literally an item that says, I have a great deal of power, right? Okay, so it's pretty face valid, and
So highly comfortable.
yes, my decisions often hold sway. You know, I have a lot of influence, you know, things you might expect. So people have different individual differences in how much people feel that they're powerful. We looked at the fit between those individual differences, and we forced people into some sort of role in a dyadic interaction with a confederate where they were put in a position of power or low power. Our hypotheses, building on these findings that we discovered by others, that people are likely to express themselves more under circumstances where there's fit than when there isn't fit. But what we did, we thought was sort of novel, because we weren't just interested in whether people had to be more powerful. That didn't seem particularly interesting to us. Okay, you're cooperative, you're in a cooperative requiring role, you're more cooperative. Okay, we weren't looking at power, the effects of this fit on your expression of power. Instead, we were wondering if there were broader effects on self-expression, whether being in this position that felt good, comfortable, you're at home in, might pave the way for you to express yourself on dimensions not even related to power. Okay, so for example, your emotions, your opinion, all sorts of things not necessarily power or power-related dimensions per se. And although we did in our studies assess self-reported self-expression, how much are you expressing yourself, okay, we also wanted to use more indirect measures of self-expression. So because we were putting people in these dyadic interactions, we have a person who's observing the participant, a confederate, and is able to rate the participant, and we can look at the correspondence between the confederate's rating of the participant and the participant's own sense of who they are. With the idea being self-expression is signaled by there being a lot of coherence, congruence between how I see myself and how others are seeing me. It must mean I'm signaling who I am if you are picking it up and getting it. There's a lot of match between who I am and how you're seeing me. I will concretize this and give you one example. So we measured in one of these studies that we conducted, we measured participants' trait power using that scale I mentioned earlier, weeks before they came into the lab. We gave them a very simple cover story. You have to engage in this role play interaction. Got to fill out some surveys before, during, after. Okay, so you are going to play one of two roles, and here's another participant who is actually a confederate of the experiment. And you guys are going to have to play one of these roles. Imagine you are in an art gallery, and one of you, for example, is the art gallery owner. So this means you are in control of the art gallery assisted low power role in terms of their outcome. You're evaluating them, giving them a performance evaluation. The actual dyadic interaction involved looking through a book of art, pictures, like 6 different pictures, paintings, and it was very scripted. The confederate was trained to play either the high or low power role, but the bottom line is participants were led to believe that they were either being evaluated during this interaction by this other participant, the art gallery owner, or they were told they were the evaluator. They were the high power gallery owner evaluating this other participant, the assistant who was being evaluated for the regular performance review. We measured various things. We made sure they felt, they understood their position of power, that they were owner or assistant to the owner, and we measured their emotions. So how did you feel during that interaction? So this is what they were feeling inside their private internal experience of the interaction. We separated participants and confederates. At that point, confederates rated, confederates blind to condition, they don't know the participant's trait power critically. They rated each participant's emotion. And we're looking at how much they cohere, okay, with the assumption being if you're showing your emotions outside, then someone's going to be able to accurately discern them. Okay, computed congruence scores. Lower numbers indicate more accurate discernment, more self-expression. So we have low role power, art gallery assistant, art gallery owner, high power role. Pink line is people who are high in trait power. So you see, as we move toward being in a high power role, the scores are lower, meaning the confederate is getting their emotions more, discerning them more accurately, whereas for dispositionally low trait power people, it's the reverse. They're being known, their emotions are being seen, picked up more accurately, presumably because they're showing them more under low role power conditions than under high role power conditions. In other words, when you're dispositional and role power fit versus do not fit. Make sense? Okay. So power certainly, there's lots of evidence, our own included, Dacker's, social class-related findings from Rudy and others, that power certainly can amplify expression of the self, but like many psychological and behavioral phenomena, there are nuances to the story in that they're important at times to take into account, such as this notion of person-environment fit. Okay, so for the last sort of section here, maybe 10 more minutes, I want to turn to the subjective experience of self-expression. I want to turn to this notion. I'm very interested, I'm very concerned so far with how power affects your self-expression, and now I'm asking, how do you subjectively experience that? Are people experiencing that? Are they realizing that they're, and perhaps enjoying that experience of expressing themselves? And what I'm really referring to is this construct of authenticity that clinicians, developmental psychologists, social psychologists, many people have written and researched. This subjective experience of expressing and acting in line with your inner true self, with your inwardly experienced traits, values, states, beliefs, goals, what have you. In lay terms, authenticity is thought of as being true to yourself, wearing your heart on your sleeve, being known by others. Now, I'm interested in this, one, because it's widely argued that people have this fundamental drive to be true to themselves, to be authentic, and in turn to be known by others. But I'm interested in it also because there's a lot of evidence suggesting it's not just this kind of interesting thing to talk about, it matters. It's linked quite compellingly to both personal well-being outcomes, psychological and mental health, and it's linked, what I'm particularly interested in, it's linked, being authentic in relationships, it's linked to relationship health, okay? Being able to be yourself and be known by others matters for your relationship happiness and longevity and so forth. So I don't know what your perceptions are of authenticity, but suffice it to say, my point here is that it is an outcome that many are interested in and that does have significant downstream consequences. It's operationalized in various ways. We're really good at just sort of asking people things and hoping for the best. Hey, how authentic do you feel? Direct self-report measures. It's also assessed in various indirect ways. And one way which matters, because it's in the study that I'll tell you about, researchers often have participants, and there's some Western cultural bias here, but we have participants rate themselves on, say, extroversion across a variety of different roles, situations, contexts, what have you. So how extroverted do you feel with your friends, at school, in the office? And the idea here is that being more authentic, being more true to yourself would be displaying less variability in your extroversion ratings across contexts. The idea that if you're constantly changing yourself to fit the situation, you're certainly not being true to yourself. That is assumption. We've done some cross-cultural work that suggests it doesn't hold across all cultures, so if you were thinking that, you're right. Anyway, but these are Western participants. And another indirect way is the way that I mentioned just now in the study I described, where people look at the congruence between others' perceptions of you and your own ratings of yourself, with the idea that presumably you're feeling more authentic, you're expressing yourself more when there's that congruence. You're being seen as you see yourself out there in the world. So what we were interested in simply in this set of studies by Michael Krauss and Dacker, we collaborated on this, that we simply wondered, is power associated not just with self-expression, but this subjective experience of authenticity, and presumably then the downstream consequence of authenticity, like well-being. Is power good for well-being? Would be the broader question here. We tested the power authenticity link across various studies. One of them, very simply, we manipulated power we use this overused, probably, manipulation of power, where we simply asked people to recall a time when they were in a position of power, when they had control over others' outcomes, if they were in the high power position, or they were asked to recall and write about it and mull about this situation when they were in a low power position. Someone else had control over them. This is a priming task, essentially. They're sitting there writing about this experience, presumably feeling, at least momentarily, high or low power. Then they're simply asked for an indirect measure of authenticity to rate themselves on the big 5 dimensions across different contexts, 3 of them. And then we looked at the variability in their ratings. Is there a lot of variability, or are they able to just be who they are across these different contexts? We also use direct measures of authenticity. How authentic do you feel? I feel like I can be myself with others, for example. We found, consistent with what we expected in light of our other findings, that power is indeed associated with both direct and indirect measures of authenticity. This is the indirect measure. Higher values equal, meaning you're more variable in your ratings of yourself. So your extroversion, for example, across contexts. You're changing your extroversion to fit the situation. This would be signaling less authenticity. So you see a significant linear effect where you get more variability in the lower power condition relative to the higher power condition. And we also had a neutral control condition where they would call the last trip to the grocery store or something like that, something having nothing to do with power, presumably. So consistent with this idea that social power is linked also to the subjective experience of self-expression or authenticity. The direct measure was there as well. Condition was correlated with self-reported direct measure of authenticity. And we actually also found mediational evidence. I mean, what I actually take now in retrospect as more important is that self-concept consistency, this variability measure, is in fact linked to direct reports of authenticity. I think that's maybe the most important thing to take away here. This is all correlational, that mediation model, so we didn't manipulate, obviously, self-concept consistency. Others in the years since we published this, 4 or 5 years ago, others have replicated these findings and documented, so we don't have to, the downstream link to well-being. So power is linked to authenticity, and this indeed does have that longer-term well-being benefit. Sorry about this, I'm just trying to get it. Okay. Last bullet point, okay? We've been talking about power and authenticity. This is an interesting finding. We're finding it, it fits, it jives with our other research. Others are finding it, that's pretty cool. I had a graduate student, Mu Ping Gan, who just graduated this past spring, and there was a visiting scholar here a couple years ago, Dan Keller from IPSR, and we started thinking about this connection between power and authenticity, and wondering, for a variety of reasons, I'll explain in a second, whether that this linkage could in some way work the other way around. So the reasoning was that as many researchers have argued for both human and non-human species, that human and non-human species frequently form hierarchies. We're really good at inferring hierarchy and inferring accurately the power of others, even based on very minimal cues, even based on thin slices. So we're really attuned to hierarchy. To us, why we cared about that was that it suggested to us that people are going to form stereotypes of what powerful people are like. Of course we have stereotypes about what high and low powerful people are like. Power is going to be associated with certain kinds of behaviors and tendencies. And what that implies is that if someone displays those tendencies or traits, that could serve as a signal to power to themselves and to others. For example, if we have the stereotype that powerful people can get away with everything, they can break rules and get away with it. I have that stereotype, and there's empirical evidence to support it. This suggests that not only does power lead me to break rules more, but if I see someone breaking rules and you ask me to guess how much power they have, I may well infer and may well be correct that they have relatively high in power. And this, in fact, has been demonstrated. Power has been associated with thinking more abstractly, and unbelievably, when you make people think more abstractly, they feel more powerful. So there's a link there between power and abstract thinking. People in power are more likely to take action, get up off their chair and do something. people who take action are seen as being more powerful. There's these mental associations out there, and it ought to matter, and it ought to hold, it would seem, reasonably for power and authenticity as well. So we predicted, and Ping predicted for her dissertation, wanting to look at this idea that authenticity, when you behave authentically, or you perceive that, this tells you, it's sort of this self-perception cue, serves as a signal of power to yourself and to others. So, we're still working on this paper, battling the editors, the reviewers on this. So I would just give you an example of 2 quick studies, really simple studies. In one, we simply manipulate authenticity. It's not a particularly easy thing to manipulate. Everybody wants us to manipulate it behaviorally. We'll get there. But in this instantiation, we simply ask them to recall a time they behaved authentically versus a time when they weren't true to their values, goals, beliefs, and so forth. So a recall sort of priming manipulation. And then we simply had them rate themselves on a variety of trait dimensions, some of which were power-related. Lo and behold, people who are asked to recall a prior authentic episode rate themselves significantly higher on power-related adjectives than people who are asked to recall an inauthentic episode in the past. You might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, and these recalls, they might be coming up with situations, if there's this link between authenticity and power, well, those in the authentic tradition are probably coming up with circumstances when they were in a position of power. This is true, this could happen, and we went through all the open-ended responses and looked at only those participants who recalled situations that didn't involve power asymmetry of any kind, and we still get the effect. So the locus of the effect is an authenticity leading to power, not that in that authentic episode in and of itself you were in a higher low position of power. So we tried to address that very obvious alternative explanation. Last study to demonstrate that authenticity, so Mu-Ping and we argue, not only should signal to yourself that you're higher power, which is pretty cool, we thought, but should signal to the social world, you can count on me to lead you. I want, look to me to be your power holder. So in this study, very simple study, we had participants, you don't even need to read that, I can just describe it. We had participants read a vignette about a target person, and we manipulated how authentically or inauthentically this person is behaving in this vignette. So at a dinner party, are they expressing what they really feel? Are they holding back and not expressing their authentic opinions? We cross that manipulation with how positively or negatively the target felt, because there's research out there suggesting that positive affect is associated with power. So we wanted to rule that out as a possible alternative explanation because you can imagine that being authentic might feel better than not being authentic. So we manipulated that orthogonally. So we had high and low authentically behaving participant target who felt either good or bad about their behavior during that dinner party. And then we had participants rate this target on how powerful they are using a variety of adjectives. Hey, how powerful would you judge that target person to be? How decisive, how in control? How effective do you think that target would be as a negotiator? How effective do you think that target would be as a leader or manager? These all cohere together. We created a single index. They showed all similar results. And here's the findings for one of those dependent measures. So we have the target acting authentically or acting inauthentically. We have them feeling good or bad about it when they're acting in those ways. And we see 2 main effects and no interaction. So indeed, feeling good, someone who feels good, you think they're more powerful. That wasn't our interest. Our interest was more that the 2 bars here on your left are higher than the 2 bars there on your right, regardless of the affect associated with engaging in that behavior. So again, no interaction, suggesting that, separate from our effect, yes, there was this affect interpretation, but we were interested in the effect of authenticity on inferences of someone's power. Okay, let me summarize. So I took you on a little post hoc journey of things we've done in our lab related to power and self-expression. Here are some of the things we think we've learned so far. I feel very confident that we have shown that the reach of power's influence extends to the self in a variety of ways, focusing today on self-expression. I have been interested for a long time on stability and malleability of the self-concept, on how people see themselves. And what our data suggests, I think, is that power can be a major source of stability insofar as your position of power is legitimate, stable over time, what have you. Because if power is allowing you to express yourself, your power is stable, this is who you are consistently. At the same time, we know that power can change over time, even within the same day, so should also be thought about, given its link to self-expression, as a major source of malleability, shifts, contextual variability in the self. I think that the data I've shown you today tells us, or adds to a literature on how do you acquire power. That's an interesting question. How do you acquire power? Well, you have prestige. Okay, you competence signal. You signal you're competent. You stand like this. You wear glasses. What have you? You be a man. Okay, all different ways to gain power in your own eyes and/or those of others. What we're adding here to the story, and it's something accessible to anyone, is acting in line with your own inner states, values, goals, emotions, and so forth. And again, it's not just you having this own inner authenticity party. Okay, our data are suggesting that acting authentically shows that people pick it up and they may infer and grant you power as well. Finally, I'll say that, like many have argued before us, that power is very likely self-perpetuating, and that's true for a variety of different reasons. The rich get richer and so forth. But one of the reasons we're shedding light on is this bi-directional relationship between power and authenticity. Power enhances your tendency to express who you are, and on the flip side, expressing who you are bolsters and potentially maintains that power that led to that self-expression in the first place. Okay, thank you for your attention. Questions? 5 minutes. Dr. Green? Yeah.
I was wondering, is the link between authenticity and power, do you have to be aware if you are authentic, or if do you have to be self-aware about your own authenticity, or is you can think of a typically clueless person who may not know anything about themselves, but yet that's authentic maybe, but they wouldn't have insight into being authentic.
Yeah.
Would they kind of think you were too?
But no, they didn't ask that. But related to that question is whether it's got to be hard to be authentic. Because when it's hard, there's some sort of barrier. You're going to be more aware that you are being authentic versus, hey, I like chocolate ice cream. I just ordered chocolate ice cream. Technically, I'm being authentic, but it's not a particularly salient, authentic experience. I don't know the answer to that. My intuition, that is, I don't know it empirically. My intuition is that anything that, probably awareness would enhance the effect. So yes, I think so, but I'd like to believe that the link between authenticity and power for some could be automatized, and it could be something you infer without necessarily consciously intending to. I don't know though.
Or maybe somebody could be, think that they're authentic, like I know myself, even though they're completely wrong.
Yes.
And still feel powerful.
I think that's true. That's a separate way. I think that is true. I mean, as a self, which is one way that people distinguish the self and personality is that the self is about the subjective experience, regardless of its grounding in reality. Okay, and that's where I live, and that's what I care about. So it's your subjective experience, regardless of what others consider. Yeah.
I can't help but think about this experiment going on in Iowa, and wondering, are those people who are flocking to someone just because he's incredibly powerful, tells us so, are they feeling more powerful themselves, or are they feeling more safe because they believe they're not powerful? I don't understand exactly.
Wait, which one are you talking about?
Well, the people on television we see in these Republican.
Oh.
And where the whole story seems to be presented, each of them is presented increasing, I am more powerful than you, I am more powerful. And how do the observers, what do they come into the, what makes them attracted to this? Do they feel more powerful themselves?
I don't, I mean, I think that's separate from our findings. I don't think that, well, I mean, yeah, anyway, I can make sure I won't. I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but I mean, people's status can certainly wear off on those they're associated with, you know? So there's even findings showing that if you hang out with more good-looking people, you yourself are judged as more good-looking. So it may be people, maybe people have the intuition that align, well, I mean, it's not an intuition, you know, aligning yourselves with the majority or feeling a part of a growing majority is going to garner you more power. But I can't explain the Trump phenomenon. I'm moving to Canada. I mean, it's just so upsetting. I don't even know what to say. So, Bob.
So I have this intuition that you said this sort of in passing. That you said that it's like, well, of course, we're being
I said it once.
You said
I said it once. We'll see clear.
But you also said that you said so.
Did I?
Let's suppose you're male and you're handsome, beautiful, and you're rich. Does any of this really apply? I mean, isn't this in a way? These are the rules of the road for the weaker, less beautiful, less male kind of.
Why? Why would that be?
It just seems like these nuances of whether a rich, handsome male alpha is or.
I mean, that person is not in a position of power all day long. I mean, he may completely be in a low power position with regard to his significant other.
I'm just asking the question,
Yeah.
whether, probably because so much of this was done with undergraduates and simulations, you just really, you know, if you repeated this reason, people who are actually powerful in the world,
Yeah.
who lead in the world, would your prediction be that you'd find that these same factors would be important, or that really the rules of the road for power are different depending on your natural endowment, you know, where you start from?
You got natural endowments, you threw me
Wrong
in
word.
the
Is it
but it is true that the majority of our studies are done with undergraduate participants, but not all. I mean, we do have older participants. In some studies, we ask people who are actually working in the real world and do replicate our effects. So I don't have any conceptual or theoretical reason to think that to make different predictions for that.
It's human nature.
Yes, I think so. That is what we'd like to believe, yes.
You know, I'm seeing something that's sort of parallel.
Yeah.
A little different from the gender aspect, but I found myself kind of worrying about the reality of people in organizations who are
Yeah.
power. You know, you have statistics of like 90% of people that come to boss when there's a problem in
Yeah.
the organization. They're afraid of speaking up, and partly because they'll get punished, essentially.
Yeah.
And when you look at the reality of being in low power, it isn't easy to then say, well, then be authentic and speak up because you can just slap down. I mean, we can make judgment calls of, it isn't necessarily being authentic in the sense of knowing what to believe, but you make a judgment call what to express and to whom in what context.
Right.
And given that, you kind of wonder, where's the root to this freedom of people in fact with all the power?
Yeah. It's a great,
And I suspect, back to the corruption issue, is that power, you don't take power from people easily. A good friend of mine back in the 60s, a black Harvard Law rebel rouser in the way told me, people don't give up power. You have to wrest it from them. And I know that plays into the corruption, but these dynamics are there.
Yeah. So let me be clear, one, that, you know, I've emphasized how power need not always corrupt, but the truth is that there's a ton of data suggesting it does make you more selfish because, you know, from whatever perspective, even an evolutionary one, many people's default goal, default tendency is to think first for the self. And so the reason why power is likely to corrupt, and I think it happens more than it doesn't, is because the default thing is to focus on one's own outcomes and what one stands to gain, and that's probably an adaptive thing in many respects. So I wasn't trying to say that, you know, it was an even fair game between corrupting and not corrupting. I think it's definitely biased toward corrupting. But in terms of the real world, I am actually involved in the real world in that I do some of the executive education and lead these authentic leadership workshops with real people out there in actual organizations. And one of the things that I'm really, I hasten to acknowledge when I'm talking about the merits of trying to be authentic in the workplace is that authenticity involves some degree of flexibility. It's not a rigid thing, and there are realities in life. You can't tell the boss to go screw off when you actually hate him or something like that. But those are really, there are these very dramatic, isolated instances of standing up for what you believe, but there's a lot of other hours and circumstances and interactions at work where you can be authentic nonetheless. Even if you can't stand up to person X, there's person A through J with whom you can be authentic. You got to pick your battles. Authenticity is not an all or none thing. So I would stand by authenticity even in the real world where there could be a really ogre of a boss around whom no one can be authentic. There's a fear, perhaps. There's still ways to be authentic, and they could matter. They could matter. They could matter for, you know, your well-being in that workplace. Did you want to say something related to this?
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Phil?
Another topic?
Okay.
I wanted to relate this to part of your work that you didn't talk about today, and that is close relationships.
Yeah.
And do you or other people study the implications of power and authenticity, actually looking at, say, couples or people in close relationships, and how does that play out?
In terms of like relationship outcomes, or?
Well, or relationship processes. I mean, how does it look when you have couples where they differ in power or they're similar in power, and how does it happen, and then what kind of outcomes happen?
I'm certain we have data like that, even if not a publication, and that there is that relationship. So, you know, one of the studies I mentioned there was with romantic couples, and we have lots of data on romantic couples. But that hasn't been the focus of how authenticity is linked. Like I hinted at earlier, the link has always been on implications for authenticity for relationship outcomes. It's a good thing for relationships to even just feeling as if your partner sees you for who you are is good for your relationship, even if it's not completely grounded in reality. We have this paper that just came out, I saw it today in JPSB, announced in an email about how feeling understood, feeling like you're being known during conflict actually takes away the typical negative effect of conflict on relationship health. Right. So we have those kind of things, but not the power piece in these things. Yeah, but I could again, I would imagine it working perhaps similarly. Okay, one more?
I was wondering, so people who express themselves more consistently, authentically, and we split between 2 groups where they felt either good about it or felt bad about it.
Yes.
And I was wondering for people who may predominantly feel bad but still consistently express themselves authentically, maybe like people in lower power positions who what they're saying isn't well received, but they stick with it. If the stress associated with continuously doing that affects their self-perceived power and what the effects are.
Yeah, I mean, it would negate each other. It may not, if it fills you with such overwhelming negative affect, it may override any positive benefits with authenticity. The other thing to think about in that vein, in which reviewers and others have talked about, is it would seem it would hinge a lot on the outcomes of having behaved authentically or not. You know, did you get in trouble? Did you have good outcomes, bad outcomes? It's a lot more complicated than we initially thought, but we're still sort of unpacking that.
Well, thank you. The reception has been moved to the 3rd floor of Coleman Hall, a reception of Power and Authenticity Unleashed. So thank you very much.